Welcome to the 2025 Ethico Benchmark Report. We're going to be diving into all the metrics you need to know for hotline and investigation management. Our industry is really at this inflection point. The next 10 years can look wildly different than the last 10 years, but it's going to take us engaging a little bit differently. It's going to take us making small tweaks to our program that are going to have an outsized impact on the engagement that we're getting from our stakeholders. What is the game of ethics and compliance? What is the game of human resource? Well, it's crowdsourcing risk intelligence across the organization, processing that risk intelligence, and then providing insights back to the point of risk. When we can get more participation into our risk management apparatus, we can really have a transformative impact on the organization. All right, let's dive in. The first metric we're going to talk about is case closure time. Case closure time is extremely important to manage and monitor because it is a high-level barometer for the overall efficiency of your investigation process. So what you can see here is that the average case closure time of the Ethico cohort group dropped an entire day from 23 to 22 days. That is still about 50% faster turnaround time than the status quo average out in the industry. So your investigation efficiency is really critical. You have people that are raising their hand to speak up, to share some risk intelligence with you, and you want to close those cases as fast as possible, but no faster. The general rule of thumb is to close your cases in 30 days. That's a good average to kind of shoot for. But of course, keep in mind that more complex cases, some higher risk cases are naturally going to be aged longer. So we never want to cut corners on our investigation process just to solve for a metric, but we do want to apply consistent process adherence regardless of case type, so that we can close those as quickly as possible. So when we flip this metric on its side, it tells an interesting story. So this graph is showing that distribution across 4 different buckets: the 0 to 30 day bucket, 30 to 60, 60 to 90, and 90 day plus bucket. And so obviously we want to try to have a higher concentration, or as high of a concentration as possible, toward the lower end of that bucket range. You can see here that about 80% of cases are closed within that 30-day bucket, with less than 5% in that over 90 bucket. So again, you want to look at your operation and look for systemic issues that might be causing things to be aged longer. So what you want to do is think about your investigation process as a business process. A business process is always something that can be improved. Getting on the road to continuous improvement is really more of a mindset than a destination. So when you can break down a business process into its composite pieces, or its composite steps, you can almost always, and I would say almost 100% of the time, you can find which of those steps is really the bottleneck on the entire system. So focusing efforts on getting things unstuck at that particular bottleneck can do a lot to affect your aggregate case closure time. For example, we often see a choke point on triage. So when you can leverage technology to do more of that triage automatically and get the right information into the right people's hands more quickly to where they can hit that ground running, those case closure times can drop significantly. We recently had a large multinational manufacturing client come over who had average case closure times of around 40-something days. Within the first 2 months of moving over to the Ethico system, that was dropping to under 5 days. And that's not because Ethico is so smart, it's because when technology can get the right information to the right people and those people can just start working versus just responding to a notification in their inbox, you can really get a lot more efficiency in that process. So look for opportunities, look for outliers in your data set, look for opportunities to fix or get unstuck certain steps in your process, and this number can come down a lot closer to this average that our clients are seeing. The next metric we're going to talk about is issue anonymity. This is like the granddaddy metric. There's so much information value in this metric. Issue anonymity is really a barometer for broad cultural health. How safe do people feel raising their hand and speaking up and sharing some risk intelligence? How much do they actually believe in the protections that you've put in place to get this risk intelligence from them? So you can see from 2024, almost 75% of reports came in identified. That's obviously very critical. We want to get that number as high as possible because you know what it's like trying to do an investigation where there's no way to reach back out to that person to get those ancillary details or fill in sort of some of the gaps that may have come in through the web form or come in through the intake. So issue anonymity is one to absolutely focus on, and this is where you should start to see changes first relative to initiatives you have to raise your speak up. A good tip to improve your issue anonymity is to first diagnose where you are relative to the Ethico dataset or relative to the NavX dataset, just as a starting point, and then start targeting and looking for opportunities for improvement. One thing that a lot of our clients end up doing is they incorporate in their intake script a thank you at the end, or they'll incorporate in the intake script at the beginning an introduction that helps to convey the protections that are in place. So much of our job is really a game of influence. We know that there's all this risk intelligence out in the organization. It's our job to activate those human sensors in the organization to share it so that we can do our job and we can direct our efforts towards those risks that matter most. The biggest thing that we have to overcome is this trust thing with the workforce. What we have found is that compliance programs that are forward-thinking, ethics programs that are forward-thinking, are doing a lot more of kind of behind-the-scenes sharing with their stakeholders to help them understand what that team's initiatives are and why they're trying to do it. So sharing, how the sausage is made, so to speak, and sharing and saying, hey stakeholders, hey employee base, our job is to make you feel safe in your workplace. Our job is to give you channels to speak up and protect you. And this is how we go about doing it. So much of this is about education on the front end, but then on the back end, it's all about that follow-up and the level of respect you are applying to those people who are speaking up, because everybody talks. So if somebody has a bad experience where they feel like they're raced off the phone, or somebody has a bad experience where they don't feel like their voice is heard, they're going to share that with their coworkers at the water cooler. On the other hand, if they have a great experience, like our callers have experienced last year, 92% satisfaction with that intake, well, that allows for a lot more potential, chatter, a lot more potential word of mouth spreading across the organization. We as an industry are nowhere near the natural limit of like pieces of risk intelligence or reports within the organization. We can have orders of magnitude more reports, more risk intelligence that can allow us to show our impact more readily and be more helpful to the organization. So really try to focus in on your issue anonymity. If this rate is materially lower than where you'd like it to be, there's probably an education issue. There's probably a marketing or influence campaign that you can drive to really start to move that needle. So one other thing about issue anonymity is this is a very helpful metric to look at in conjunction with another metric. Having a low anonymous rate and a low reporting rate is a much different story than having a low anonymous rate and a high reporting rate, for example. So depending on where you're at with the marriage or the intersection of these two metrics, that's going to give you a different playbook to run in order to move those in the right direction. For example, if you have a really low reporting rate and a really high anonymous rate, that's a trust issue. So we have to get some more of those reports unlocked. We have to convey a little bit more about what these channels are, how they work, and what protections are in place, just to start getting more reports. When the workforce can start to see that their voice is being heard, that floodgate is going to open, and through more interaction with the reporting mechanism, you're going to start to see that trust build and that anonymous rate drop. But you just have to keep in mind, all these metrics are movable, and all of them are movable a lot faster than you think. It just takes a little bit of intentionality. So again, very few of these metrics are going to tell a story in isolation. Looking at them in conjunction with other metrics really help give us a better picture and a better understanding of the shape of our operation. So what we're looking at here is case closure times by channel and by identified versus anonymous. And you can see that it tells a very interesting and different story. Across the board, an identified report always gets closed significantly faster than an anonymous report. And you can see that regardless of channel. There's a pretty tight clustering of between 16 days on Hotline and 22 days online on a web submission. That's about a work week difference across those four identified. On the anonymous side, we have almost a 2-week differential, a 2-week range with a low point of 20 days on the Hotline side and almost 30 days. This is kind of like a work month on the online side. And this is of course for anonymous. I would argue that one of the biggest drivers for your case closure time is your proportion of reports that are anonymous. We want to get that anonymous rate as low as reasonably possible. You're never going to have, 0% anonymous, right? You're always going to have some people who have been jaded or they've had a bad experience before, who have that self-preservation activated, and they're going to, engage in an anonymous way. We want to get those people in the middle though to raise their hand. We saw last year that about 50% of the folks who called into our hotline that wanted to remain anonymous converted to identified by the end of the call. That is primarily driven by the adaptive interview, the human-centric approach where we're having an actual conversation, not just asking them 5 questions and racing them off the phone. That more organic interaction with your stakeholders allows for a more human experience. It allows them to get their questions answered. It allows them to understand the process a little bit more. And by the end, more than 1 out of 2 times, they end up converting to identified. So that has true implications on the effectiveness and the efficiency of your investigation process, because if an investigator knows who they have to reach out to, knows who raised their hand to get some of that additional information, whether it's a manager or other a witness or whatever else is entailed with that investigation, they can do their work a lot more quickly with a lot less slippage. How can we, again, diagnose where there might be some gaps or where there might be some opportunities for improvement? again, in my experience, it always comes from bouncing one metric up against another metric. And this really tells an important story here. Reporting channel use and overall reporting rate is an important metric for you to measure because you need to be tuned into where the reports are coming from, while at the same time, hopefully you're agnostic about which channel is utilized. In the best programs, there's a certain agnosticism across channel because we don't really care where the risk intelligence is coming from. We just want it. We want to be able to act on it. We want to be able to do something with it. So the challenge then becomes, how do I create the circumstances for success to where I can be actually agnostic across these different channels? That's going to come from a thoughtful application and a thoughtful training of these different channels. If possible, I want to have similar case closure time and I want to max out my possible reporting rate across all these different channels. So on the hotline side, a human-centric approach seems to do a lot to drive those case closure times down, give better information to investigators, and give a better experience to that employee who's speaking up. So dialing in that hotline side, allowing for an adaptive interview, a human-centric approach can do a lot to max out that channel. With respect to the online channel, there's kind of two approaches that most companies take to building those online forms. On the one hand, you have a highly complex form that asks any potential question that you might want, for an interview. Those are great because that has high information value, but that also has a high abandonment rate. The quality of information that comes through an overly complex form can be substandard and can end up, kind of putting an investigator on their heels and kind of having to start from scratch. On the other end of the spectrum, other companies say, hey, you know what, we want to meet people where they're at. And so we're going to have a very, very simple form. It's just a box that says, hey, tell me what happened. So that's a nice story to sell, but what ends up coming through there are many times massive tomes, the data's not structured, and sometimes it's hard to diagnose exactly what kind of a case it is and what additional questions you wish you could have asked. Maybe those aren't answered in that response. So the happy medium on maxing out that online channel, that is going to continue to increase over this next decade, is really a hybrid approach. We want to have a form that when a user or when an employee looks at it, they're not overwhelmed by it and like, oh my gosh, this is so much information. So we want to make it simple on the start, but depending on the types of answers they're providing, depending on the category or depending on, the severity type question that's answered, allowing for dynamic questions to follow up so that you can capture some of that additional information can make your web reports feel a lot more like your hotline reports, assuming your hotline reports are giving you better information. And then finally, the third channel, which is in person. This is like where the battleground is over the next decade, okay? And the first time in our lives, in any of our lives, we're in a situation where managers have a lower engagement level than their people. This is kind of the hangover from COVID and from the work from home and the new normal and all this kind of stuff. We've all been kind of like pushed into the pool. Nobody really knows how to manage in this remote way, right? Like everybody's reinventing the wheel. That's very stressful on managers. Belts are getting tightened. Pressure from on high is unabated. And so there is a pinch point right now at this middle management group at a time when this group is most critical for us to unlock our programs. We know 65% of people saw wrongdoing last year and in the workplace. We also know people are 6 to 8 times more likely to go to their manager to report something than they are to utilize the anonymous channel that you have in place. So if we want to build a culture of integrity, which is really just the sum total of all the impressions of the people in our organization, and if those impressions are oversampled or overly influenced by their interactions with their manager, well, these managers, these middle managers throughout your organization are a fertile ground for you to drive some organic culture of integrity vibes forward in the company. But it's going to take us activating them. So we've seen a good gain on the in-office or the manager proxy reporting over the last year, but there is a lot more work to do here. I'm telling you, over the next couple of years, the programs that focus on activating those middle managers and the programs that are able to make that group kind of sing the same song to harmonize with the compliance or the ethics team and really kind of drive that forward, they're going to totally separate from other organizations or other departments that just kind of pay lip service to it or just keep kind of doing the same things. So this is a really strong group. There's a lot of potential in this group, but it's going to take us, like I said at the start of the video, it's going to take us interacting with that group in a different way and activating them in a different way. Okay, so zooming out, big picture, average reporting rate across the Ethico cohort was about 3.5 reports, and that's a little bit more than double the status quo that we've seen sort of pretty stable over the last 10 to 15 years. So again, keep in mind, your job is to find risk intelligence in your organization and provide insights back to those points of risk. You can't do your job, if in fact that is your job, you can't do your job unless you're getting more of this risk intelligence. Your company is not like out of risk intelligence. There's risk intelligence freaking everywhere. So we just have to figure out some ways to open it up. And it's crazy. Everybody wants to work at a company where their voice is heard, that they're proud to work at, that is, doing good things. Everybody wants that. We as ethics and compliance folks, we want that as well. So we just need to kind of build that bridge and build a little bit of that trust, and these floodgates are really going to open. The next metric we're going to talk about is issue categories. The best benchmark with respect to issue categories is yourself. Every business has different taxonomy of categories and subcategories and so forth. We go through our entire data set of several 100,000 reports, and we try to aggregate those into like categories to give you a sense across the entire cohort group where reports are coming. But comparing historically to your own, category proportions in the past is really the best place for you to look and to start to try to diagnose where there might be significant changes. At this size of a data set, 1 or 2% moves across this highly sort of stable metric are pretty significant. So at the highest level, about a quarter of the reports were HR reports. That's been pretty stable as long as I've been in this industry, and that was true from 24 to 25. A couple of interesting moves. The first one I want to talk about is the ethics and compliance reports specifically. Those jumped 1.5 points. I would suggest and I would bet that we're going to see a continued increase in the proportion of compliance reports within the entire reporting operation, particularly over the next year, if in fact we are stepping into a more of a recessionary environment. There's a lot of economic headwinds right now, and we always know that during times of a recession, there is increased pressure and there's increased wrongdoing. So if we are potentially heading into that kind of an environment, we need to be smart on the front end to see what we can do to curtail some of that wrongdoing. So starting with a campaign right now to start planting some seeds so people can start opening their eyes for anomalies that they might see, risks that they might see popping up, and reinforcing that with an education around your commitment to speak up, your commitment to anti-retaliation, your explanation about how these channels work and so forth can do a lot to get out ahead of what may be a potential issue over the next 12 months. Remember, we have a unique value to provide to our organization because we see so much. We're the circulatory system of our organizations. So we have the potential to be getting input from all of these different departments and aggregate that together from a bird's eye view and help our organization see around the curve. That's where we can add really a ton of value. So be thinking about your business. The last time we had a recession, where did you see some issues? Did you see more fraud issues? Did you see more corruption issues? Was there more waste and abuse type of issues? How can you use your business's idiosyncratic, personalized, unique experience historically to set yourself up for success if we are starting to hit choppy waters? A couple of other interesting movements is on privacy. So privacy dropped 1.5 points, pretty significant because that has been on an upward trajectory for the last couple of years. Again, think about your categories as really kind of a response to the zeitgeist. What are people talking about? What are people thinking about? What's in the headlines? There's always a correspondence. My last tip on categories is you want to revisit your categories from time to time, but you don't want to do it too much. So maybe once a year, once every couple years, really zoom out and check your categories and see if they're capturing the right information. From time to time, maybe you have discrimination as a category and harassment as a category, and under your current code of conduct, those should really be one thing. Well, go ahead and combine those. It should be very easy for you to change your current categories, but don't forget to change your historical categories. You want to retain that time series analysis capability, which gets broken if you start changing category taxonomies in one year, and that breaks the comparative, potential for historical years. So again, that should be something that's simple, but make your categories work for you. You don't want to have 10,000 categories. You want to have as few categories as possible, but no fewer. Okay, so think about how you can utilize those categories in a really clear way to drive the type of impact that you want to have. The next metric we're going to talk about is issue severity. This is a super critical metric because this is, in many cases, what this line is here for. All of your cases should be categorized based on how severe of an issue it is. This graph breaks down issue severity into 3 buckets. Severity 1, which is severe and urgent. Severity 2, which is severe but not urgent. And severity 3, which is everything else. About 85% of cases have been in that severity 3, that everything else bucket, and that's been pretty consistent over time, even through COVID. And about 14% or 15% are what we would call high severity issues. So that's severity 1 and severity 2. These are severe urgent or severe non-urgent issues. What you want to look at is really how have your severity issues, or the proportion of your cases that are quote unquote severe, how have those changed over time? And if there is a statistically significant change, can you point to what a major driver of that change is? Sometimes more severe cases happen because of a acquisition or a chemical spill or a pandemic, right? Thinking about how you can better communicate what's severe and what's not severe, both to your team and to your vendor partner, can do a lot to make sure that your team's eyes are going on the most important things most quickly. We've seen a lot of issues over the last year with clients coming over from other providers due to the mishandling of severe cases. You might not get in a car accident every single day, but when that happens, you want to have insurance. So you might not get a high severe call every single day or every single month, but when that pitch comes across the plate, we want to put the bat on the ball, and the system needs to work in those high acuity areas, in those high acuity times. So think about your issue severity. If you're getting too many false positives or you're getting too many false negatives, there's probably a definition issue that you need to work out. So ChatGPT it, or just kind of think through what those definitions should be, and make sure that you're on the same page with your vendor, and make sure you're on the same page with your triage person as well. The next metric is issue substantiation. So we saw a little dip in issue substantiation over the last couple years, but it's now skyrocketed back to pandemic and pre-pandemic levels at almost 60%. So about 60% of our clients' cases were substantiated last year, compared to about 40-ish% at the status quo. So issue substantiation is an important metric to manage. You know, we're trying to max that out. I mean, we're probably never going to get to 100% substantiation, particularly when anonymous reports are available, but we want to try to push this definitely above 50%. So if you see that you're kind of below 50% on your substantiation rate, I would first tell you to look at an education initiatives. Unsubstantiated reports are really a function of that reporter not providing enough good information for us to act on, to validate, and to substantiate. Also, an adaptive interview, either on the hotline side, where someone can spend 15 minutes with a caller if they need 15 minutes to ask those additional questions and really fill in a good fact pattern for the investigator that's downstream that's going to get that report, or on the middle manager level, utilizing some kind of training. You can utilize that toolkit I mentioned before, but activating those middle managers and helping to ensure that they know what they need to get from somebody who brings that report to them can do a lot to move the substantiation rate up. Remember a couple minutes ago I was talking about it's important to look at metrics in conjunction with other metrics to really get a better picture of the story, and also that can help direct our efforts, our continuous improvement efforts, at the spots that are going to really move the needle the most. So an interesting way to look at issue substantiation is to look at it in conjunction with case closure time. So if you look at your cases that are aged in, again, those 4 buckets, 0 to 30, 30 to 60, 60 to 90, and 90 day plus, and then look at substantiation rate across those buckets, that might tell an interesting story. So it tells an interesting story in aggregate across the entire Ethico cohort, because we see it kind of drops down, which is what you'd expect, right? Those quicker cases are easier to substantiate typically, and those more aged cases are usually a little bit harder to substantiate. But what you'll see on the screen here is that in that 60 to 90 day bucket, that's turning into kind of a no man's land. So we see a drop there that ends up moving back up to the 90 day bucket. So we have 56% in the 0 to 30 day bucket, 54% in the 30 to 60 day bucket. It drops down to 49% in the 60 to 90 day bucket, and then back up to 52% in the 90 day bucket. That is in aggregate. Your data set might tell a different story. But again, looking at it across these different buckets and cutting substantiation across case closure time might give you some clues as to what types of cases or what types of situations tend to get aged out. This is a business improvement process, right? We're in a continuous improvement mode. We're going through that flywheel of plan, do, check, act. Planning means establishing some kind of hypothesis for improvement. Do, it means I'm going to do a little bit of a test. Check, I want to check that test to see if that corresponds with my hypothesis, and if it does, and if it's good to go, I'm going to act, and I'm going to roll that out, and I'm going to change my process across the board. That plan, do, check, act flywheel, it goes by a couple of different names, is the mindset that you have to be in. When you're in that mindset, your mind is automatically going to start looking for opportunities for improvement. And so when you can give your mind, when you can feed your mind a new look at your operation by cutting one data point across another one, you can find some real points of leverage that can drive your metrics in the way that you want them to go. Next, we're going to talk about reporter types. So who's actually reporting? There's been some interesting movement on this over the last year. So a little bit over a year ago, there was this big push in our industry to really reframe what we're doing, not just to pushing papers around, not just responding to fires, but we are processing risk intelligence. We are de-risking our organizations, and we're building these cultures of integrity that require the participation of stakeholders. Stakeholders, of course, are not just employees. They're related parties. They're vendors. They're people up and down the stack who are interacting with your organization. So we saw a pretty significant jump last year in 2 major categories that have recently been relatively more opened up for reports. One is customers and one is vendors. The risk intelligence for your organization doesn't just exist within the four walls of your business. You have stakeholders like vendors. You have stakeholders like spouses of employees who see things that we want to try to gather, because our job is not just to get risk intelligence from our employees, it's to get it from all of our stakeholders and improve our organizations in a sustainable way. So last year we saw a 5% jump almost in customer reports, and almost another 5% of reports were coming from vendors and contractors. Analyzing who is reporting and where these reports are coming from can often give you clues on where you might want to put some more attention and where you might want to drive an additional campaign. So about a year or so ago, there has been a lot of chatter in our industry about trying to get more risk intelligence from more sources. And last year we saw a lot of our clients open up their channels to some of these other groups, whether it's related parties, whether it's patient families, whether it's vendors and contractors, and that had a really great effect because we saw some significant movements last year. We should be agnostic about the risk intelligence we're getting. I don't care if it's coming through the hotline or it's coming through the channel. I don't care if it's coming through an employee or that employee's spouse. I just want to get it so that I can put eyes on it and put some effort on it and either stamp out the fire or add a process, fix a process to like mitigate it in a sustainable way. Your vendors and contractors, your related parties, they have good intelligence, they have good information for you to get, and it's very easy to open your channels up to them. So take a look at your reporter types over the last couple of years and look for significant changes and look for reasons why those changes may have happened. Try to substantiate those. But if there's a bunch of surprise changes or a bunch of surprise swings, it might be worth looking into, and it might be worth considering where you might be able to get some more risk intelligence on the vendor side if you're significantly lower, or some more risk intelligence from the related party side if you're significantly lower than these benchmarks. How are people finding out how to report? Measuring engaging reporter awareness is a great best practice for you to understand where your efforts need to go and where your efforts need to not go. So what we've seen is a continued increase in the proportion of awareness that's coming from the web. So if you're not easily found on Google, when someone can type in, Acme ethics portal, where that can pop up and they can find that number, then you're probably leaving a lot of risk intelligence on the table. You have to be smart about meeting people where they're at, and you have to make it easy to give people the information they need. I mean, think about how you work today versus how you worked 5, 10 years ago. I remember I used to have to organize my email. Now I just search it all, right? So we have to figure out ways to give people the to put the information at their fingertips when they need it. One of the best ways to do that is having a Googleable portal that contains all of your ethics stuff, or all your human resource stuff, or all your employee relation stuff, so that an employee can just go there and figure out what they need. I don't think we're going to get back to a point where 50, 70, 80% of awareness is coming from posters. I think the world has moved on from that. However, that's not to say that there's not a lot of value in physical awareness materials inside of your organizations, inside your plants, hospitals, whatever you have. But there's no silver bullet with awareness. We have to think of ourselves as marketers. Coca-Cola markets across Twitter, and they market across Instagram, and they market on shows, and they do billboards, and they do signs, right? Like, they come across all these different channels with a consistent message to try to activate the consumer to pick out a Coke from the cooler. To the same extent, we need to activate a diverse group of stakeholders across multiple different channels if we're going to increase our odds of their participation, which is a prerequisite for us doing our job effectively. So look at how people are finding out about it. If you don't have that in place right now, it's very easy to get your vendor to add that field and to start tracking that. And over the next quarter, you can start to see, well, where are people really engaging? Look, we want to fish where the fish are at. We want to put our messaging up where the eyeballs are at, but it's becoming increasingly difficult because there's a multitude of channels and there is an increasingly high bar for someone's attention. So awareness is not a one and done thing. It's not a silver bullet type of a thing. It's a process that we have to constantly engage with and constantly tweak to drive that behavior that's going to come from us piercing that veil of attention. So issue sequence and follow-ups are important to monitor and manage, because these are things that are just going to kind of clog up your operation. Both from an intake side, there's going to be more stuff for you to sort through, but also it's going to clog up the employee experience side if they have to follow up multiple times because they haven't gotten a word back or their case isn't closed. All that stuff starts to spread, and all that kind of feeds into whatever brand your Speak Up program has, okay? So last year we saw about 16% of cases had follow-ups as opposed to the industry average, which is a little bit closer to 30%. So if you find yourself at that 30 30, 20% level, start thinking about, well, what is it I can do to try to reduce these follow-ups? Can I follow up with reporters more consistently? Can I simply tell my reporters, whether it's through the hotline or the web or at the manager level, can I just give them a little bit of a glimpse of what this process is going to look like and what those next steps are? What I find is that most folks that come over to Ethico, they're not spending a lot of time thinking about this. You know, they're well-intending, right? But they're inadvertently kind of leaving some of these people who are raising their hand and engaging with the program the way that we hope that they will, kind of leaving them out to dry. Try to humanize your experience as much as you can and recognize that there's a human being on the other side of that report that probably has some anxiety about it, that has probably put their neck on the line, or at least from their perspective, they put their neck on the line and they've taken some risk to be this sort of culture champion. A little bit of gratitude for that and a little bit of follow-up with them can really do a lot to drive this number down and maintain sort of a low volatility investigation operation. Look, you're always going to have some follow-ups, and some of them are healthy, but usually what I find with follow-ups, they're what I would call unhealthy follow-ups, where it's someone who's repeatedly coming back to check on their report because they've got no correspondence and no indication from the investigation team that their concern is heard and it's being managed. So just think about how you can close that loop and keep that person engaged and let them know that, hey, I am working on it, I don't have an answer yet. One other thing, this is just kind of a bonus tip. It's not that tough to set a reminder for yourself 30, 60, or 90 days after a case is closed, particularly with an identified person, to follow up with them and say, hey, just wanted to make sure that you haven't experienced any kind of retaliation. Hey, I just wanted to follow up and thank you, or reaching out to their manager and telling them, hey, you know, this person raised their hand and notified us of something that was really important. Kudos to you and kudos to them. Doing small things like that, coming up behind it and really humanizing your program can do a lot to change this battleship and change, you know, the slope of the curve of impact that you're having inside your organization. So again, this is kind of the theme for this year. We have to do things a little bit differently, and we have to kind of rethink. We can't just keep putting one foot in front of the other. We have to, from time to time, pause, make sure that we're still on track, make sure that we're still heading toward the summit that we're climbing toward. So think about what you can do to get some of these things unstuck and just start whittling away at it. The last thing we want to talk about is abandonment rate. This is kind of the silent killer in all operations, and it's not something that many of us have our eyes on. So abandonment rate is the proportion of reports that are started that don't get completed because someone's waiting on the phone too long, or because the form is too complex, or because they don't feel like they're being respected, right? This can be a very significant number. The status quo abandonment rate is somewhere between 15 and 18%. The Ethico abandonment rate is about 1%. That means 1 out of 100 fish that bite the line end up swimming away that are not reeled in. When you compare that to something like 15 or 20, that's a very significant difference, particularly in the context of 1.5 reports per 100. When we are thirsty for more speak up, anyone engaging with that, we have to get them in. We have to treat that person with respect. We have to treat that human being who's putting their neck on the line with enough dignity to get the information we need and not sort of burn that bridge. So think about that abandonment rate. If you're interested, you should ask your vendor how you can minimize that. Is there a way for them to answer all those calls live? Is there a way to humanize that experience a little bit more? It's critical that at each step of the path, you can zoom out and look at each of those individual steps in the context of what that end goal is. If the end goal is an improved organization that has a better culture of integrity, the entailment of that is that people feel like their voice is heard. So what do we need to do to make sure their voice is heard? Sometimes shaving off too much on the front end ends up really disproportionately affecting that end goal. So think about how you can really optimize that and build in some good follow-up to really humanize that experience for the person speaking up. Look, this new chapter is starting. We're right on the edge. We're right on the precipice of this new future, and it's going to be on us to make that future a reality, a future where ethics and compliance is not viewed as a bumper sticker or the office of no, but they're viewed as strategic advisors, strategic risk mitigating assets for the organization that can lay the foundation for the culture of integrity that builds toward all these positive externalities that every business is shooting for. Lower turnover, higher growth, higher profitability, all those things that the board and that the executive team cares about are things that we are uniquely positioned to affect and to influence. But again, it's going to take us stepping out, zooming out of our operation and looking for strategic ways to engage in a different way. When we can start to do that, I mean, it's crazy the type of impact that we can have. So thanks for watching. I hope you found some value in this. If you'd like to download the report for free, you can go to ethico.com/BMR2025 and grab that for free. And then every Thursday at noon Eastern, we do a webinar series called the Ethicsverse, and we're going to be doing a deep dive on this report with a bunch more tips and so forth. So hope to see you there.